Good evening, everyone. I'm Molly Young from the Miami University Alumni Association. As part of the Objects That Changed the World lecture series organized by the Miami University Humanities Center and the Miami University Alumni Association, today we present The Photograph with Pepper Stetler. Pepper Stetler is Associate Professor of Art and Architecture History and Associate Director of the Miami University Humanities Center. Professor Stetler has published numerous articles on the history of photography and has contributed to catalogs for exhibitions at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art and the Museum of Modern Art in New York. She is currently curating the first museum-scale exhibition of the work of Cincinnati-based photographer Nancy Ford Cones, which will be on display at the Taft Museum of Art in the fall of 2022. In 2016, she received the College of Creative Arts Crossin Hayes Curry Distinguished Educator Award. Welcome to Pepper Stetler, and thank you for taking the time to join us today. Questions were collected during registration, and Pepper will address some of those throughout the webinar today. You'll also have the option to ask questions during the webinar by clicking the Ask a Question button at the bottom of your screen. Please note that in the interest of time, we may not have time to get to every question. Today's webinar will last about an hour, including time for questions and answers. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Pepper.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much, Molly. It's a pleasure to be here, and hello to all of you out there. I'm so happy that you could join me today to talk a little bit about photography. If there ever was something that changed the world, I think we feel the impact of photography with us even today in the 21st century still. So let me share my screen here, and then we can get going. Okay, great. So before we begin talking about photography, I wanted to say a little bit about the series Objects That Changed the World. So it's my talk today is part of that series, Objects That Changed the World, which is organized by the Miami University Humanities Center and the Alumni Association. This online lecture series invites us to contemplate objects that fundamentally reshaped human experience, from concrete and porcelain to the birth control pill and the first blues recording. Each talk explores the history and cultural legacy of a transformative human creation. Sponsored by the Friends of the Humanities, Objects That Changed the World celebrates the central role of the humanities in a Miami education and modern society. If you would like to become a friend of the Humanities Center, please consider a donation to the center in any amount. Annual gifts from Friends of the Humanities are indispensable to funding the Humanities Center's workshops, fellowships, student programs, and alumni outreach efforts. Fulfilling the center's commitment to students, faculty, and the public would not be possible without your help. Please join the generous alumni and friends who have invested in the future of the humanities. Every dollar makes a difference. And to learn more about the important work of the Humanities Center at Miami, you can go to www.humanitiescenter.miamioh.edu. And to become a friend of the Humanities Center, you can go to www.givetomimiamioh.org/Humanities Center. Thank you. Thank you very much. So with that, the title of this lecture series, like I said, is Objects That Changed the World. And this title imparts certain assumptions about historical change, especially with technological inventions like photography. There is often the assumption of a narrative about inventions that goes something like this in a nutshell. A lone genius invents something that solves a long-standing problem and improves the lives of many people. The improvement and importance is instantly clear to the inventor. Why would he have invented it otherwise? And it's usually a he, introduces it to the public, and he is immediately celebrated. His genius genius is immediately recognized and the public begins to use the invention for the exact purpose and in the exact form he had intended. And with that, we are one step closer to our conception of that invention in the present moment. So such narratives like that one I just kind of sketched out are created from the convenient perspective of hindsight, right? We know what how significant the invention of photography was from our perspective in the 21st century. But especially with the invention of photography, it is hard to imagine the circumstances in which its presence and uses wasn't immediately logical. When an object changes the world, how might we understand the world before we were ingrained in the logic and convenience of its presence? In other words, it's hard to unsee it, right? Like it's hard to denaturalize photography in our world and imagine a place where the photograph didn't seem like such a seamless part of our experience as humans. So in reality, what I wanted to show you and talk about today is how the invention of photography in the 19th century really comes in fits and starts. It was not the product of one person or one like moment of eureka-like genius. So two things, questions I wanted to sort of talk about this evening were, who were the inventors of photography? Because as I'll show you, there was more than one inventor of photography. There's, I think, 5 that I wanted to mention tonight as part of the kind of narrative of the invention of photography. And what did they think they were doing when they produced an image that we now call a photograph? One more thing I wanted to go over and think about before we dive into the history here is thinking a little bit about what a photograph is, because I think if you were born after 1990, probably you might not be actually that aware with what I'm talking about when I'm talking about a photograph in the 19th century, right? Because it's not a digital image. And that's one thing I'd like to hopefully get a chance to talk about at the end is, what is the connection between this history of the invention of photography in the 19th century with what we know of as photography today? So what is a photograph in the old school sense, like an analog photograph? What do you need to make a photograph? Well, you need light, right? That's an essential thing that you need to make a photograph. You need a surface on which that light would be recorded. We'll see various surfaces used for that during the 19th century. You need chemicals to cause the surface to change color when it's exposed to light. And then you need chemicals to stop that exposure that exposure when the image is finished appearing on the surface, right? So you need both to figure out the chemicals, the chemically sensitive chemicals, but then you also need to figure out how to stop that exposure when the image appears. And then you also need a subject, right, to record on the surface, or you might say something that blocks the light, right, and can differentiate between light and dark on the photographic surface. And then I think most people would say that you need a lens and you need a camera, but you don't really need that. And I'll show you how some of the earliest photographs today were actually cameraless. They were not taken with cameras or lenses. And the inventors were kind of figuring out how to do that in other ways. So another thing to ask here is, where did photography come from and why was it invented? One thing that should be acknowledged is really the idea of a lens and a person looking through a particular well, actually light coming through a lens to cast an image onto a particular surface was around since Aristotle. Aristotle actually describes the ability of a lens to focus light and cast an image on a surface, way back in the time of the ancients. But also there's other suggestions of people interested, say like Leonardo da Vinci, in the way in which certain frames and grids can be used, and an aperture basically to fix an image to make it easier for one to draw. And it has really been suggested that you could even look to something like Leonardo da Vinci's drawing of a draftsman here from 1510 as a kind of genealogical predecessor of photography. And there's a way in which, you can think about, he's using this board here in this drawing that Leonardo gives us. The artist is using this board basically as a way of reducing one eye of vision to two, kind of like we do when we look through a viewer of a camera. And he's also making the representation of a product of fixed vision, right, with little variation or even artistic choice, right? He, to some degree, is trying to remove the human flaw or the human variation involved in recording a particular image or transferring a object from 3 dimensions to 2. And certainly that seems like something that was often motivating the inventors of photography. They were interested in finding a way of recording an image that eliminated the hand of the artist, or the hand of a person to be able to record that, right? So recording by nature is a way it was often put in the 19th century. So like I said, artists and thinkers had been familiar with the idea of a lens that would project an image onto a screen as light passed through that lens since the time of Aristotle, at least. And we know that many artists in the 18th century were interested in using something called a camera obscura. Camera obscura just means dark room, and it is where the idea of a camera comes from, obviously. But so this was a tool that artists used basically to cast an image into a dark room, and then an artist would go into that dark room and kind of trace the image as it's seen on the wall, cast onto a plane or a surface in that room. So you could do it this way with a larger room, but artists also used a smaller box in which, again, light would pass through this lens and cast an image onto a plane in the back of this camera, and then the artist would kind of peep through this compartment here and trace the image. So obviously at this point in the 18th century, you see this desire to have an image that is produced by nature, right? That to some degree eliminates the hand of man, although at this time that's not yet possible, right? The elimination of the hand of the artist. We don't know in the 18th century, artists didn't know the chemistry involved in being able not only to kind of produce an image. Light sensitive chemicals were not known yet, and also certainly one of the big hangups until the mid-19th century, as we're going to see here, is finding the chemicals that would allow the image to fix on the plate, right? To not just keep exposing, right? So the chemicals to stop the exposure, so the image would stay on the plate. So we see this kind of heritage that photography emerges from, that's in the world of image making, right? Of art, of making art, and finding the easiest ways of tracing or drawing images from the natural world. But you could also look at the moment in which the first photographs are finally made in the 1840s, and see it also as a moment, and photography as being a kind of child of the Industrial Revolution, right? Other inventions made around the same time as photography is, say, the steam engine by James Watt in 1769. You have the electric field lines invented by Michael Faraday in 1826. So there's a way in which even the moment of photography's birth, photography seems to kind of stand in between the worlds of art and science, right? It seems to be the kind of like product of the marriage of art and science in these two traditions, right? Certainly you could see photography as a machine of image making, right? And it comes very much from both of these traditions and not just one. So the inventors of photography had very different intentions and different motivations for developing photography. I'm showing you here on the screen now what we consider today to be the first photograph. In the history of photography, it has that like privileged special place, although it wasn't really discovered or seen that way to be the first photograph until the 20th century, when it was basically found, and now it is part of the Harry Ransom Center at the University of Texas in Austin. So this was made by a man named Joseph Nicéphore Niepce. And I'll say now, like, one thing I love about the beginnings of photography is it's full of people with these amazing names. Like Nicéphore Niepce is so fun to say to my students when I teach about this. Nicéphore Niepce was a man who, when he made this photograph, was actually looking to invent something really entirely different. He was interested in making a printing process, a process that might be seen as similar to lithography, that was actually by this time just a couple of decades old, that printing process. And he was interested in his experiments kind of turned to the techniques that would eventually yield this photograph, by trying to find a method that could print images from nature onto a lithographic stone. So without an artist having to draw on a lithographic stone, but rather projecting and fixing an image onto a lithographic stone. And we know from the notebooks that we have of Nicéphore Niepce's work that he runs into the troubles of the trouble of making images stabilize, or fixing images. This is the image that we have that survives of what he makes, and you can see that more almost 200 years later, it's very faint, right? You can barely make out what we're actually looking at here, and what we're looking at is Niepce seems to have pointed his camera outside the window of his estate called La Grasse in France, and takes an image of a chicken coop that's outside of the window. But again, it's very hard to see, and this is because Niepce was, even at the time, having difficulty getting chemicals to stabilize the image once it had exposed. Around the edges, it's gone very, very dark. And another thing that you should notice about this image that makes it very different and strange from the way that we think of photography today is that it's on pewter, right? So it's on a metal plate, and it's a direct positive, right? So Niepce in no way at this time is conceiving of or is able to print a negative and then print positives from that image. We think that's actually what he was trying to do. Considering his interest in printmaking, that would make sense, that sense of reproduction would occur to him. But in fact, this is what he gets. He gets a direct positive on pewter, on metal. This image, by the way, is very, very small. It's like the size of I would say like a 3x5 index card or something like that. It's very small, so don't get a sense that from your screen it's giving you a sense of what the image is, the size of it. But this is what he does, and we also know from his notes that he thinks of this as a complete failure. Like he kind of gives up on it, because what he's really trying to do is make a printmaking process, and isn't really interested, or doesn't really see yet the value of the photographic image that he has actually produced, which to us today might seem pretty amazing. So another thing I wanted to mention about this is that this image takes it took Nicéphore Niepce 8 hours to expose and get enough light recorded on the plate to be able to read the architecture. So this is something else that we are very far from the conception of a snapshot, right? Images at this time are taking Niepce several hours, and we'll see it very quickly move to several minutes instead of several hours. But this also affects the way that the image looks, right? We have light that seems to be kind of coming from multiple angles and directions. So this is what we've got. And reading this image, it's an issue of whether we want to see this as directly part of a kind of artistic tradition, right? Was Niepce really thinking about making a picture when he pointed his camera outside of the window and took this image of his estate? Or was he just trying to get enough light to get something to record, right? So we have this kind of tension already in photography between like picture making and its technical capacities. So Niepce, like I said, is not satisfied with his photographic process yet, and he learns and comes into partnership with a man named Jacques-Louis Mandé Daguerre. See, I told you it's full of these wonderful French names. So Daguerre is an artist in Paris, and of the inventors of photography that I wanted to talk to you about today, he is the one that has the most artistic training. He's trained as a kind of a landscape painter or an architecture, someone who specializes in the representation of architecture. And he is interested in capturing the drawings of light to serve what he is working on at the time, which is a diorama, which is a form of entertainment that has often been seen as being a kind of precursor to cinema and films in the early 19th century, where Daguerre had this sort of theater where he would show images like the one I'm showing you here of his diorama of the Temple of Solomon, and through various illumination changes he could get the image to look differently and create a kind of motion or change about the image in his diorama. And we think that he was interested in capturing the drawings of light to serve his diorama in Paris. That was a pretty lucrative business and a very popular form of entertainment in the mid-19th century. So Daguerre hears of Niepce's experiments, and Daguerre and Niepce form a partnership, with Daguerre kind of as the businessman of it and Niepce as the brains that had done most of the work of figuring out how to capture an image. And then Niepce dies in 1833. And what happens is that Daguerre kind of works with what is left of Niepce's experiments, and eventually comes up with a photographic method that builds on Niepce and is also able to kind of secure the image on the plate much better than Niepce was ever able to do. And Daguerre eventually comes up with something that he, in no humble way, calls the Daguerreotype, right? Like he names it after himself. And there's always a little bit of a sense of showmanship about Daguerre. Daguerre doesn't often give much credit to Niepce and honor their partnership. It looks like Niepce contributed a lot of the experiments of photography, and Daguerre seemed to just kind of put the finishing touches on at the end. And he doesn't seem like a particularly humble person, naming the first photograph the Daguerreotype. And I have on the screen for you here a little bit about like how Daguerre made the first Daguerreotype. Like what Niepce was working on, the Daguerreotype is a direct positive image on metal, this time on a copper plate usually. And what happens is that the plate is cleaned and sensitized and then exposed to light. And then what is different about Daguerre's invention is that the Daguerreotype is a latent image. So you have to, once you expose it to light, you then have to expose it to hot mercury vapor. Gotta love the 19th century, right? So Daguerre is like dealing with hot mercury vapor in his studio and his experiments, which is incredibly toxic. That would allow the image to appear, and then the image is desensitized, and you have a direct positive, right? So again, I want to mention that these Daguerreotypes are very small, like the size of, in the case of the Daguerreotypes, about the size of like a business card, really pretty tiny. This also helped make the image clearer, right? Because it had a smaller surface in which the lens to focus on. So it's a small kind of image, and Daguerre is kind of shopping his invention around Paris, and basically wants to sell his invention to the government to get a pension. And he finds a man named Francois Arago, who is a politician and a distinguished scientist. And Arago kind of takes up Daguerre's cause and lobbies for his invention and gets Daguerre a lifetime pension from the government. And Nicéphore Niepce's son is also given a pension, but the contribution of Niepce is basically ignored by the government. In his sort of announcement that I've put at the top, you can really tell that Arago here is sort of selling Daguerre's invention as French, right? Like a French contribution to the world. And there's it seems as if Arago was not interested in complicating Daguerre's case in any way. So this is like the first example of the narrative that's told about the history or the invention of photography is really different from the messiness of the development of that invention itself, right? Daguerre is kind of sold to the French public as this hero inventor and this genius when the circumstances were actually much different. And another thing I wanted to mention is that, you know, if you asked somebody in 1850 what the future of photography was going to look like, they would have said it looks like the Daguerreotype. The Daguerreotype was immediately the most popular form of photography. I'll tell you in a second about the other side of it, which is like the paper invention of photography. But in the 1850s, the Daguerreotype was much more popular than paper photography, and the future looked like it was the Daguerreotype. So reasons for that were because the Daguerreotype image was much sharper than what you could get on paper, but also some of the reasons for the popularity of the Daguerreotype over paper photography were legal. So the way in which Daguerre sells his invention to the French government, instantly everybody can find out how to make a Daguerreotype, and anybody can open a Daguerreotype studio in Paris and in France, right? So there's instantly this kind of boom of photography studios in France at this time, which makes it incredibly popular because Daguerre sold the recipe to the French government and didn't keep it for himself. But one way in which the Daguerreotype really thrives is in portraiture, right? And I wanted to show you this image just to give you a sense of how people interacted with daguerreotypes at this time, right? So one thing about a daguerreotype is that it was almost always in a case of some sort, as you're seeing here. The image on the surface of a daguerreotype is very fragile. It can be really easily rubbed off if you would put your thumbprint on it. And so it was very often under glass and put in a little case like this. And because of its rather small size, it often had this very sentimental and intimate relationship with the viewer, right? It was sort of put in this keepsake case that made it seem like this incredibly special image. And another thing I should mention is the way in which you see on this photograph, this daguerreotype of this anonymous man, that very often the cheeks would be given a little bit of color to give the subject of the portrait a little bit of life, rather than looking entirely black and white. This would be kind of just tipped in color, carefully added to the daguerreotype before it was given to its owner. But all these ways in which, daguerreotypes do not participate in the kind of reproduction of images. You can only have one daguerreotype. And that's very different from the way that we think of photography today. But other things, the way in which photographs like daguerreotypes are associated with sentimental memories or images as almost kind of surrogates of loved ones in the mid-19th century. I would say that kind of tradition of photography still remains with us today. So in order for Arago to really sell the Daguerre's invention of photography to the public, he really had to make sure that nobody complicated Daguerre's case here for being the one inventor of photography. But there were so many people, actually. I think there are about 20 counted by scholars who came out of the woodwork after Arago made this announcement of the invention of photography in 1837 and claimed to have invented a photographic process, right? Like it was this sort of I am Spartacus kind of moment where everyone was like, well, wait, I was doing something like this. I was making some kind of image. And one of those that's the most interesting is a man named Hippolyte Bayard. And he makes he presents his photographic invention to Arago, and basically Arago kind of tells him to beat it and leave him alone, even though Bayard did indeed seem to invent a unique photographic process. Bayard's photographs, as I'm showing you here, are paper prints, but they're direct positives like Daguerre's are. So he uses different chemicals to get the image on paper instead of metal, but it is distinct from Daguerre, and he does kind of have a case for it and feels a bit jilted by Arago and creates the image that you're seeing on the left, which is a self-portrait as a drowned man, and makes this kind of fantastic and very kind of tongue-in-cheek description of his own death being caused by, his disappointment at it being snubbed by Arago, as you can read from the text on the right. But there's all sorts of ways here, again, where Bayard is taking up photography as this form of narrative, right? And a form of creativity as well, but also showing a very early example of the importance of the relationship between image and text too. The way in which this image is kind of explained by the text on the back and given this fantastical meaning that it otherwise wouldn't have been clear from just looking at the image. So there is somebody else who was very interested in when Daguerre's invention was announced in 1837, and that's a man named William Henry Fox Talbot. Talbot is British, and he, in fact, was deeply interested in the announcement of Daguerre's invention because by that time he had come up with a photographic process as well. And it is a photographic process that is much more familiar to us today. Eventually, Talbot comes up with a negative on paper on which you can print multiple positives, right? Which is more of the kind of logic of photography that we expect today. But Talbot begins his experiments with fixing an image on paper around 1833. And I'm showing you here a drawing that Talbot produced in 1833 on a vacation to Lake Como in Italy. And he kind of shows us this drawing as an example of why he invents photography, because it sucks, right? Like this drawing is terrible, and Talbot recognizes his lack of drawing talents, and he's trying to use a kind of device called the camera lucida that I'm showing you over here that has an image that projects through a prism onto a piece of paper, and then one can draw it. It's very difficult to use, and it was just not working out for Talbot at all. So his as he tells the story of it, his motivations for trying to find a way of fixing an image come from his inadequacies as an artist. Talbot is not as you can see, a trained artist at all. He's a scientist. He's kind of a gentleman scientist in the 19th century, where he is a man of independent means, but can kind of like, dabble in the new scientific experiments of the 19th century that are emerging. And these are two images that Talbot makes when he returns to England. And they're made in 1835 around his estate called Lacock Abbey. The one on the left, again, shows us this kind of connection between text and image here, in which the text tells us something about what we're looking at in the image that would be very hard to see otherwise, right? Another thing that Talbot notes here is the way in which he seems to, when he writes this, realize that the sharpness of the image is going to fade over time, right? And he's using the text as a way of compensating for that, of showing us that what was once there but will no longer be. And you can tell that these images are very experimental, and he's simply trying to kind of get some sort of contrast between light and dark down on paper here. He's making images with small cameras, as he tells us here, with the camera Obscura, but he's also making what are called photogenic drawings. Drawings that are they're cameraless. These images are not made with a camera, but are made with kind of pressing botanical specimens onto a surface and then exposing that to light, and then fixing it, and then removing the specimen, and the image of the specimen would remain on the paper. So he's again sort of positioning his experiments in the kind of world of scientific experimentation and new processes of scientific inquiry that are emerging at this time in the 19th century. One thing that I always find totally fascinating about Talbot is that he is making negatives, right? Like he's making a negative here. He's making negatives here as well, but he doesn't get for a long time the idea of printing a positive from that. Like he sees the negative in the camera as a failure, and he doesn't get the idea of just print it again and you'll have your positive print, which again shows like how foreign our ingrained logic of photography is today, that was so foreign to somebody like Talbot in the 19th century. And then his buddy, the very famous scientist John Herschel, kind of points out to him, hey, it's a negative and you can just print the positive from the negative. And then he gets rolling from there, I guess. But in 1835, Talbot, he's messing around with photography, and then he kind of stops. Like he moves on to a different kind of experiment. And then, like I said, in 1837, here's with the rest of the world, Arago's announcement of Daguerre's invention, and Talbot is kind of like, wait a second, I was working on something like this 2 years ago, and takes it up again, and really then starts to focus and market his invention. And he soon realizes that the advantage of his invention is paper, right? Paper, and also the ability of his image to make multiple prints from a negative, right? So he markets his invention as a book, right? He calls his book The Pencil of Nature. He publishes this in 1844. And creates this book with glued in paper photographs that basically kind of explains his photographic process and suggests and even anticipates some of the uses for photography and its associations that even hold on today. So this is one of the prints from the Pencil of Nature that's called The Open Door, where he sort of acknowledges the artistic capacities of photography, relating it to the traditions of the Dutch school, as he says. But others take on more social and even scientific kinds of purposes. This is an image from the Pencil of Nature called Articles of China, where he basically anticipates the use of photography as evidence, right? As kind of legal evidence. It says at the bottom, should a thief afterwards purloin the treasures, you have this kind of record of your possessions that could stand as evidence against in front of a jury in a legal case, right? So there's again that way in which Talbot is kind of casting a very wide net about what photography's purposes might be, and really a lot of those purposes are still with us today. So there's one more photographer I briefly wanted to mention to you, and that's a woman named Anna Atkins. The Pencil of Nature, Talbot's Pencil of Nature, is very often touted as the first photographic book, right? Like announcing this close relationship between the photography and text that would stand until our own moment today. But it was actually Anna Atkins' book, who was a friend of Talbot's. Her book of cyanotypes, a different photographic process called British Algae from 1843, that was actually the first photographic book. Cyanotypes are a different name for what is more well known as a blueprint, like familiar to architects, of course. But she uses this to make this kind of a book of botanical specimens of British algae. And I love including Anna Atkins as one of the inventors of photography, especially because, you know, she's a woman, and this new invention allowed so many more places for women to make images, and that in ways that they were kind of excluded from other traditions of artistic making. But also you can see, again, a way in which photography in Anna Atkins' book on British algae is sort of sitting in between science and art, right? She is collecting different botanical specimens, but then she's sort of collecting them in this way that looks like something outside of scientific achievement, right? It looks like a scrapbook, or something more familiar to the kind of feminine domestic world of the 19th century. So again, a kind of photographic product that's standing in between those two worlds of science and nature. I'm going to leave it there. Thank you very much, and I would love to hear any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Pepper. So you have a couple of questions that came in during the webinar. So let's see, this first one here. So this comes from Mark. Can you address the current and future viability / popularity of analog film-based photography?
Yeah, this is a great question. Thank you, Mark. Yes, so there's been a lot of photographers who have returned to analog processes almost as a kind of stance against digital photography kind of just taking over everything, right? And a lot of photographers really have a strong sense of preservation about old photographic processes. So in that way, I think as a kind of stance against stance against the domination of the digital as a real kind of cultural conversation. Analog is still around because photographers are interested in exploring all kinds of photography, not just the digital photography that is most familiar to us today. But at the same time, those sorts of processes are becoming harder and harder to do. Even in the more kind of mainstream analog processes of like Kodak film, right? Like it once was so easy to get a film of 36 shots on a roll of film developed at your local CVS or something, and it's not that easy to do anymore. As companies like Kodak, for example, move more and more to the digital, it's harder and harder to hold on to what seems obsolete and kind of resist the like constant thrust of progress and the domination of the digital at the same time. So it's becoming like a niche, right? You really have to be a sort of expert in these old processes to be able to do them anymore.
Well, I actually worked in a 1-hour photo lab for a couple of years during college. I'm really glad I switched gears because I'm pretty sure I'd be out of the job currently.
Yeah.
Okay, so here's another one. In what ways has the explosion of everybody's got a pocket camera, how has that changed the art photography scene? Have artists particularly tried to, tackle the subject in some way? I know you said it's kind of a niche thing, perhaps that's part of it. There's artists that do all sorts of different things. I think there's artists that completely work outside of a gallery context and engage with the avenues of audience streaming of the digital world, and actually put their work on Instagram, and other avenues like that. But then, there's also artists that use digital photography, but I'm thinking of, photographers like Thomas Struth and Reneke Dijkstra and other contemporary photographers that make these gorgeous digital prints that are so like lusciously beautiful with color that they almost look like they could be paintings or something, and they're blown up to the size of paintings that we expect in galleries as well. So there's this way in which photography is everywhere. So it's very difficult to say like it's this one thing now, because it's infiltrating everything. Like it's taking over the role of painting in the art world. And it's also like the most mundane, common way that we all communicate. And in a way, like photography has always been that. It had a relationship with art in the 19th century, and it also became this way in which all of a sudden, like common people could have images of themselves for the first time, which is I don't think can be overstated, right? Like, and it's so. How many images do we take of ourselves in a day now? But at that point, like to have an image of yourself was a pretty amazing thing. I took 49 pictures of my son in his St. Patrick's Day outfit before we started this. Okay, so here's an excellent question. What is sort of like the key technological innovation that has sort of served up and given us modern photography?
So if the question means like modern photography, meaning like 20th century conceptions of photography, I would say one of the most important things that actually happens pretty quickly after the invention of photography is the speed of exposure, right? So there is a big difference between a snapshot that we expect today that happens, in a fraction of a second, and what we're dealing with for much of the 19th century, which is like schlepping around a clunky camera that weighs about 30 pounds, putting it on a tripod, putting a glass negative plate in the back, and then it takes like minutes to expose if you've got a sunny day. If it's cloudy, it's going to take more. The chemical development of photography, I feel like, is something that's often overlooked in its importance, to move from an image that takes a couple minutes to an image where you can, raise your camera and instantly snap, and there you go. And that I think photography is so much involved today in the sense of the immediate gratification of ourselves through images, right? Like we demand immediate documentation of images, and I think that's probably the most important development.
I agree. The immediacy seems to have sort of like trumped all other things. Yes. Let's see. Here's a question. What role did commercial motives play in developing photographic technology? Can you comment on that? Were there commercial applications discovered after technical innovation?
Well, like Anna Atkins is a good example of that, because she invents the cyanotype, but she sees it more as a photographic process, but it will become useful to architects as a form of blueprints and printing. So I think that's a good example of it. Yeah, that's the one example I can come up with.
I think that's a good answer. So let's see. I think we have time for maybe a couple more. And this may be speculative. How did photography change perceptions of war, slavery, other sort of social concerns in the 19th century? Can you comment on that at all?
That's terrific. I wish I had more time to show you like photographs of the Civil War, and especially the main photographer that's associated with photography of the Civil War is Matthew Brady. He had a portraiture business in New York and Washington, D.C. And then when the Civil War came about, he moved on to the battlefields and recorded the war as best he could. However, like I was saying before, what it meant to record war in the 19th century was very different from what we think of now in terms of like photojournalism, because of the technical limitations at that time. But nonetheless, the Civil War was this moment in which photography was bringing death closer to a public than they had ever like experienced before. And there's this tension with Brady's photography between the kind of, shock and immediacy of death that we see in his photographs. We see dead bodies lying on a battlefield, for example, or dead bodies on a path where you see like the marks in the dirt of the wagons that just moved through the landscape. But we also know that he staged a lot of those at the same time. He would actually, he and his crew would move bodies around. So it also kind of defies our expectations of the immediacy and the really authenticity of photography at the same time. So yes, it does start to kind of change a public's relationship with war, especially, and even the U.S. government was very careful and sensitive to how Brady's images circulated, because it was, changing public perceptions of war.
it's super valuable there. I suppose photography was and changing perception and the tone of how people were receiving what was happening.
Yeah, right.
Okay. Perhaps maybe just one more. Okay, here you go. In your opinion, which is sharper, digital or analog photography?
See, it depends. So, there are some digital processes of printing that are really good. Like I said, there are photographers that make these enormous art prints that you see in art museums that are just gorgeous. But gosh, at the end of the day, I would have to go with analog. Like there's just something so materially rich about a good analog print that I just think, especially looking on a screen, but even if that's printed out in paper, there's something a bit more sterile about digital prints. And I like the analog, I think, as the sharper and more richer image.
Sometimes the old school is the best school.
Exactly.
Okay, and one last question before we sign off. This is my own personal question.
Great.
What happened to Daguerre since he was working with like hot mercury vapor? I'm assuming he made.
Right. I'm not exactly sure when people found out like, oh, mercury vapor, not a good idea. So when he died, I don't know if they knew it was because of toxic poisons from mercury vapor, but I don't think he lived a long, healthy life. Like I think he died by the 1850s, I believe.
Perhaps that was his karmic balance for like not giving his buddy any credit.
Yeah.
Sure. Well, thank you so much, Pepper. It was a great presentation.
It was a pleasure.
We appreciate you
very much
leading our webinar this evening. Just as a reminder for our audience, a recording of our presentation will be available on our website soon. And to learn more about the important work of the Humanities Center at Miami and other lectures in this series, please go to humanitiescenter.miamioh.edu. And to donate and become a friend of the humanities, please remember to go to givetomimiamioh.org/humanities center. And as always, please check out our other new and archived webinar presentations at alumlc.org/miamioh. Thank you all so much for joining us this evening, and love and honor to you all.
Thank you. Bye-bye.